Well, good morning, everybody. We are going to start the process today. We're going to talk to Colin Cerniglia. He is the author of Culture of Excellence, What We Can Learn from the Yankees About Leadership. And he's going to join us here on the Pandemic Baseball Book, the Pandemic Baseball Book Club podcast. Good morning, Colin, and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Mark. It's Monday morning. We all got tongue-tied when we've had the weekend to relax.
So Colin, I read the book. I also spent some time reading the podcast, and at first I didn't really understand until I listened to the podcast and I read a little bit about you as to why you would write this book. So, but I wasn't sure like exactly what the connection was. So what I decided to do was, as I said, I did some background. I listened to the podcast, and then when I read the book, it all kind of like the mechanisms like really kind of fell into place. Why don't you talk about the book and why you wrote it, and talk a little bit also about Talent 409, as you're the CEO and founder of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it would the easiest way to connect all of that would be to give a little bit of background on me, and then I can go into the business in the book. So I grew up in the Northeast playing all types of sports. I'm a big sports junkie: baseball, basketball, soccer. Got to play baseball all the way through college at Penn State Scranton. And when I got out of school, I was still working in a restaurant. I was actually a supervisor at the time, but the restaurant hospitality industry wasn't really something that I wanted to continue to do. I had been doing it for the last 10 years, high school through college and everything. And I really wanted to continue to work with people, because that was really one of the things that I enjoyed the most about the restaurant industry, was meeting people, learning about their stories, them becoming regulars, and just really building that connection with folks. And so that was what really drew me to the HR and recruiting world, which is where I got my corporate start, if you will. And it was within the HR and recruiting world that I developed a second passion around culture building, team building, leadership development, all of those components that you alluded to earlier in the conversation here with my podcast, with my business, and now with the book. And so the passion for all of that continued to grow. I did that for 3-4 years, and a little over 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, I decided that I wanted to do that work, but I also wanted to do it within the realms of the athletics industry. I wanted to get back into athletics and do this with student athletes, do it with coaches, versus just doing it in the corporate world. And when I say doing it, I'm talking again about the culture building, the leadership development. How do we take the off the field components and elements of a team or a program, and how does that affect our performance on the field? That's something that's always been, really interesting to me, and a question that I always continually ask myself, because it's not really easy to measure when you're talking about leadership or you're talking about culture. It's a lot of times it's just a word for folks. So I decided to start the Talent 409 Leadership Academy in January of 2018. A little before I started that, I had this idea about this book, which I thought was something that could be interesting. And it was really just an idea. I'd read a couple other books, and it was really after reading the book Legacy. I don't know if you've ever read that book, Mark, Legacy by James Kerr, about the New Zealand All Blacks, that I thought to myself, hey, there is a book about what I am trying to write. As you know, being a baseball person, most of the baseball books out there are, very nerdy, stat baseball books, and I love them. I'm a huge baseball fan, and there's nothing better than digging in and getting all into details about that. But the book that was percolating in my head was less about baseball and the stats and everything behind it, and more about the people and how that affected the wins and losses, for example, and how that affected, again, the on-field performance of the team. So this whole idea started around the same time that I started the Leadership Academy. And it's been a 3-year process, a lot of fun along the way, not just with the business, but as you mentioned, doing the podcast, which again is very similar. The podcast, we bring on guests to really talk about their experiences with leadership and with culture, and how most of them are retired athletes, so how they've been able to translate that and transfer that from the competition, the athletics, to what they're doing in life after sport. And when I decided to write the book, it was definitely the harder decision that I, as far as writing a book goes. I could have just wrote a book about, the 7 pillars of dynamic leadership, for example, which is one of the workshops that we teach through the Leadership Academy. And it would have been, very generic and just kind of based on my work and my expertise. But I really thought the story of the Yankees was interesting, and I'm happy to dive into a little bit more specifically about why it's so interesting. But that was really, the whole culture building, the whole leadership development. That's why there's the book now. That's why there's the podcast. That's why there's the Leadership Academy. That is what I am so interested in, and always trying to figure out, how does that actually affect the performance of a team?
Well, when I look at what the book, for me, yes, knowing about the author and knowing where the book comes from, is kind of my process. I think most people, when they pick up a baseball book, they want to read the baseball. They want to see what the connection is to what you're trying to say. And I think that for me, having covered the Yankees and having, interviewed a lot of the people that you not only interviewed but also wrote about, I think it's so accurate and so, when you've covered the Yankees on an organizational level, at the minor league level, like I have, and you've talked to a lot of the different coaches at the different levels, and you've talked to, Damon Oppenheimer is somebody that I talk to a lot. I've talked to a lot over the years. So when you're understanding culture and you're understanding all the different elements that you but did very successfully portrayed in this book, of how, kind of the timeline as to where this culture was, where this culture came from, where this personality, where this leadership was built. And you picked 1989, which I thought was really interesting, and of course you delve into it in the book. But explain to me why you chose 1989. I mean, I know the answer, but for the people listening and watching, why 1989? Why was that the year that the Yankee culture was, I guess, the beginning of where your story begins?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I just want to highlight what you had said too. And it's so important for me to not just verbalize it and say it, but for people to understand it. And I've had people who are absolutely not baseball fans, definitely not Yankee fans as a result, who have read this book and have gotten it. And that's the point that you brought up that I always make to people is, yes, this is a book about a baseball team, and baseball, is a sport. But the Yankees players, the Yankees coaches, the Yankees executives are people. So that's how we relate to them. And the Yankees team is a business within Major League Baseball, and we can all relate to business too. So I just wanted to, reiterate that, I guess, again, and say thank you for pointing that out. 1989, I joke that was the year I was born. That is not the reason for the start of the story. Actually, it's a long-standing running joke, if you will. I don't even know if joke's the right word, with my dad, who's been a Yankee fan dating back all the way to Mickey Mantle. Got to see him play, and my dad was a big Billy Martin fan. continues to be to this day. And obviously Billy Martin was very important to the Yankees organization as a player and then as a manager in the 1970s. But he, in my opinion, also did a lot of detrimental things to the organization. And unfortunately, on Christmas Day of 1989, Martin was drunk with his buddy, William Reedy, and the car they were driving back to Martin's house crashed just right in front of the driveway of the house. It was actually in Binghamton, New York, which is an hour south of where I grew up in Syracuse. And Martin died. And it was the end of a long-running circus or show, depending on how you want to view it, where George Steinbrenner, the owner of the Yankees, and Billy Martin had this on-again, off-again relationship, this love-hate, where George always wanted Billy when Billy wasn't a Yankee. But as soon as he was a Yankee, all the problems started again, and they just could not coexist with one another. And Martin ended up getting fired, I think it was 5 separate times throughout the mid-70s to 1989. And the craziest part of the whole genesis of the story is that Martin and Steinbrenner were at a charity event in Tampa 2 weeks before Martin passed away and had talked about Martin again replacing Bucky Dent, who was now the manager of the Yankees, at the first sign of trouble during the 1990 season. So you can see how Martin would continue to get these opportunities to manage the Yankees. And it wasn't just the fact that him and Steinbrenner couldn't coexist, but Martin did a lot of things that would not stand up in today's world. He would challenge his players, and not that there's anything wrong with challenging your people and expecting things out of them. But when I say challenge, he'd want to fight them. He got into fights with his players. He would publicly bash his players to let them know he was the boss. And he just did a lot of different things throughout his tenure, whether he's with the Yankees or the Tigers or the Twins, whenever he was managing. And then even as a player, he was a fiery personality, and he was getting drunk all the time. And just things that you would think are a little bit crazy in 2020 to be a leader of a high profile team like the Yankees. So the story starts there because of Martin's death. And I indirectly make the point that I think that started to bring some stability to the organization, because finally there was no option for Martin to come back. He passed away, and as sad as that is, it was a turning point, I believe, in the Yankees franchise history. You take that moment, and 6 months later, Steinbrenner himself is suspended for the second time in his tenure. He had paid a known gambler for dirt on Dave Winfield because he didn't think that Winfield, one of his players, was allocating his funds correctly to his charity. And for the second time in his tenure since 1973, Steinbrenner was suspended. He ended up taking a permanent ban as a way to keep his job with the United States Olympic Committee. I think he was the vice president of that board. And we all know that ended up being a temporary permanent ban. But the years that Steinbrenner was away after that ban that started in August of 1990 allowed for that stability to really start to set in. And that's where we start talking about Gene Michael, for example, and him, as you mentioned, starting at the minor league organization and working its way all the way up. Because, people may think I'm a Yankees fan. I'm not going to hide that fact. But this book is definitely not just a fluff piece for the Yankees.
No, definitely not. No, I totally agree. I think that, and myself, I'm a Mets fan.
Okay.
But, I've covered the Yankees for a long time, and just because I'm a Mets fan doesn't mean I can't, I'm harder on the Mets than I am on anybody else.
Right.
But I think it's important that you mention Gene Michael, because the ascension, in my opinion, it's always been my opinion, and I've written about this myself, is that the ascension of Gene Michael is the reason the Yankees are who they are.
Yeah.
And it always kind of burns me a little bit that we wrote a book about, Michael Lewis wrote a book about Billy Beane and Moneyball, when really, and I know you touch on Moneyball in the book, but really Gene Michael, if you're going to write a book about a guy who changed the course of a major franchise, Gene Michael's the guy, because he did all the things that you look to in your 3 pillars in the book. He did all the things. he touched on leadership. He was a leader. He was one of the few people that was willing to stand up to George Steinbrenner, and Steinbrenner always backed down to Gene Michael. He always did. And even when he fired him after the 95 ALDS, he kept him in place as basically, he was an advisor, but he basically was still, the most important decision maker, in the organization for a very long time.
Yeah.
Almost up until his death, really, because, if you talk to Brian Cashman, or if you talk to, like I said, Damon Oppenheimer or Billy Epler, who's left and gone on to other things. And, all those different people will all talk about Gene Michael as, Stick, the guy who really changed the course of where the Yankees were and where they ended up going.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's sad, obviously, that, he's no longer with us and we can't ask him to dive deeper into all these stories.
But I think he wouldn't anyway.
Very, very modest. Yes.
He was always a guy that didn't want to really deal with any of that. He was like, I do what I do, and, give somebody else the credit. That's the way he was.
Yeah. And maybe it's a generational thing, and who knows what things will be like another generation from now. But I think his impact is so important, and you see it because it's 2020 and the Yankees are still, as an organization, trying to replicate that 90s dynasty, not just from, in terms of winning championships, but the cultural aspect of that dynasty, and the way that Joe Torre, for example, was leading those players on the field. And they had Derek Jeter, and they had Scott Brocious, David Justice, those team first players. And, you're seeing that now with CC Sabathia before he retired, and Aaron Judge and Brett Gardner. And so I think it's so cool to see that, even though he hasn't been, he passed away a couple of years ago now, and he hasn't been maybe a major decision maker for so long, his impact from what he did in the early to mid 90s is still being felt throughout the organization today.
Yeah, I think if you sat down with Brian Cashman and you asked him about Gene Michael, he'd probably talk about Gene Michael more than he'd talk about any of the decisions that he himself made during the course of his career.
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of respect and reverence that a guy like Cashman had for Stick, because Stick didn't hold the fact that Cashman wasn't a player against him. That's what happens a lot of times in organizations. When you talk about culture and you're talking about personality and people, I've been around a few teams that have very, that are terribly dysfunctional. And that, right across town, New York Mets. And as we speak, supposedly later today, Steve Cohen will be signing, the agreement to take over the majority ownership from the Wilpon family. And the reason I bring up the Mets is because the Yankees have been the opposite. They've been the opposite. They've been functional. As you said, once the decision was made, and you made a really great point that I liked a lot about organizations that are, and this is, of course, related to culture, but it's also related to leadership. And that is bringing in Joe Torre. I love Buck Showalter. I think Buck Showalter is a great manager. I think that his tenure was successful. But when you talk about how, organizations are always, they're always reluctant to bring in an outsider, to bring in someone from outside the organization who's not necessarily knows the Yankee way. The hiring of Torre, who I named the best manager of all time in New York in my book, he really he was not a Yankee. He was a union guy who then became a broadcaster, who was, a manager that had very limited success. Very rarely did anybody in the media, except I believe when he was in St. Louis, kind of come out and say, hey, this was unfair. Joe's a good manager and deserved better. Of course, the famous Daily News headline, Clueless Joe, which, in retrospect, people say it was about that he had no idea what he was getting into. I
Right.
think
Right.
most people took it as that he was clueless Joe,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that he was, what is George Steinbrenner thinking by firing a very popular, successful Buck Showalter and bringing in Joe Torre, who was a failure with the Mets. I think that's a perfect example of how an organization can change everything by trusting its instinct to hire someone from outside the organization. So why don't you delve into a little about how you discuss that in that chapter?
Yeah. And it just worked out that way. It wasn't an idea that I had even originally thought about, but something that has always stuck with me from just a pure corporate background when I'm working either in an organization or I'm contracting with an organization and consulting, is their reluctance to hire. And we're talking about at leadership positions from the outside, because a lot of companies will obviously hire from the outside for like an entry level position, for example. But they're reluctant to bring in somebody from or at a leadership level, because they don't know, as you mentioned, they don't know the way of the organization, whatever that organization is. And I think if you compare this to sports and you get outside of baseball, I'm a big Giants fan, and the Giants have had a problem with this, I feel like, for a long time. The football Giants, where if you're not in the Giants family, they don't want anything to do with you. And I think as a result, they have lost out on a number of qualified, not just head coaches, but coaches in general, maybe executives, et cetera. And that's led to them being pretty average and pretty terrible now over the past couple of years as an organization. But it's just something that has always stuck with me. I've never understood why you wouldn't consider bringing in somebody if you don't internally have somebody that is capable of leading. It's one thing if you have somebody internally who can do the job, and so you promote them, and that showcases that you can grow within your company, and you can tell that to prospective candidates in the future. That's all great. But if you do not have somebody within your system right now, whether that's corporate world, whether that's sports and athletics, and you are feeling the heat to promote just because you want to showcase this mantra that you can grow your people, you're probably doing yourself a disservice. It's more important to get somebody who can lead, even if they don't know the Yankee way, for example. Just because Joe Torre didn't know the Yankee way didn't mean that he didn't know how to communicate, for example, and didn't mean that he didn't know how to stand up to the boss. I mean, he was like, besides Stick Michael, he was the first person to do that, and he was probably even more high profile person than Stick was to stand up to Steinbrenner. And so all these attributes that Torre brought to the Yankees, and it's just a really great reminder. If you are an executive within an organization, or you are leading a sports program, and you don't have somebody internally to promote, then don't do it. Don't do it. Don't succumb to the pressure. Look for somebody. There are people on the outside who fit the culture and the model. You just have to be diligent with your search and what you're looking for. And I think, like, again, if you ask Stick Michael, the things he was looking for in a manager were the complete opposite of a Billy Martin, for example. Someone who wasn't going to go to the media and bash his players, and someone who was going to stand up to Steinbrenner, and somebody who could really take command. They had a team that was ready to win. They just needed somebody to help them get over that hump. And as you mentioned, Showalter got them pretty close, and who knows, maybe he could have done it with another opportunity or two. But Torre is the one who did it. And Torre came from the outside. He's a National League guy, had the distinction of being the guy with the most wins as a player and a manager without ever appearing in the World Series. And, he somehow figured out a way to do that. And one of the ways that he did that was surrounding himself with people who had been successful specifically in New York before, and specifically with the Yankees. So like retaining Willie Randolph. and hiring Chris Chambliss and Mel Stoudemire, players that not only had competed in New York, but, Randolph and Chambliss had obviously won championships with the Yankees. So, I think Torrey is really great because he was a master at a lot of things and he was really good at his job. But I think the thing that he was best at was realizing that he had weaknesses and that he needed to fill those gaps with people who could help him. Otherwise, he wasn't going to last long enough to do what he wanted to do in New York. And he said to that team in '96 that he wanted to win multiple championships, 3 in a row. And they ended up winning 3 in a row at one point, and that's a really cool thing to look back on. But, Torrey, right from the start, I think the number one thing that he understood was that he had weaknesses and that maybe he didn't necessarily understand the Yankee way fully, but he knew enough. And if he could bring in the right people to surround him, then he was going to have success and he was going to find what his excellence looked like. And his version of excellence ended up being something that the Yankees are obviously still trying to replicate.
I really believe that, I agree with you choosing the Yankees as this culture of excellence. I really believe that we can learn from the Yankees about leadership, as your your subtitle suggests. But I also happen to think that Joe Torre was the last manager of his kind.
Yeah.
Especially in the Yankee organization, because I think that once the nature of the team started to change, once, like A-Rod came aboard and, once there was, this was like George's last hurrah, after they lost in 2001. And when they started to, really go after big ticket guys again. And, giving Torrey guys that he didn't necessarily ask for, to put on his team. And now he had to try to make it work with Alex Rodriguez. He had to try to make it work with, Randy, all these different little pieces. Because when I covered the team in 2006 and 2007, Joe Torre's last couple of years, I saw a different guy.
Yeah.
He was more resigned to the changes going on around him. I think he's been quoted in his book saying that, he had to keep reminding people in the organization that, players have a heartbeat.
Yeah.
That the game is not as important as analytics is. It's only a tool.
Sure.
And I think that you're right in that I do think that overall that the Yankees do run a tremendous organization. I wish the Mets were that successful on a consistent basis. But I do think, like the rest of baseball, there is this culture that is successful in business and successful in consistency. But I think teams aren't winning as much is because they're all using the same methodology.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the players and it comes down to talent evaluation. It comes down to, do I have the right manager in place? Do I have the right pitching coach in place? All of these things, what I like about the Yankees, that they're constantly thinking and they're constantly looking and they're constantly analyzing the data, not using the data as, just the end all be all, but there are different people in the organization. I remember not too long ago having a conversation with someone in the Yankee farm system, one of the brass, and they were talking about how we want all of our players to become Brett Gardner, somebody who understands what we're doing, adapts, overcomes, and has talent, but also has the baseball IQ.
Yeah.
Right. You've touched on how Jason Zillow, the Mets, the Yankees PR guy, how he works with the younger players on how to deal with the media and how to deal with, different levels of professionalism. I think all of those things, if we're talking about the Yankees that's what I want people to understand is that, your book proves that culture and leadership and having a solid organization from top to bottom breeds success. But where somebody like myself would argue or be devil's advocate is to say, well, how come they've only won once in 2009? Won a World Series. Isn't that what the Yankees really view as their end game? And if you don't win the World Series, it's a failure. This is my question. How does the team succeed when that's their end game? And how does that not create dysfunction? That's my question for you.
Yeah, it's a fair question. It's a great question. And so what I'm, I guess, most interested in, and so let me go back a little bit. One of the reasons that I think it is so hard to win consistently, when we're talking about winning championships, is because in 2000, when the whole Moneyball revolution started, at the same time, what happened was a new CBA was put in place with the national revenue sharing, as you're probably well aware of. And as a result of that has really made it so that there is more competitive balance in baseball than ever before, because you have teams like the Red Sox, for example, who are paying out to other organizations because they have the money to spend over this soft salary cap. Yes, there's no salary cap in baseball. There may never be a salary cap, but there is almost a punishment for spending over a certain amount of money, because you are now giving free money to other organizations where they can take their young talent and lock them up to extensions, versus them hitting the open market and the Yankees being able to fish those players and supplement their team, which was the formula for a very long time, even through some of the dynasty years, was to take some of the best players in baseball and make them Yankees. So I'm really interested to see what the next 5 years brings with the organization, because while I believe that Hal Steinbrenner, the current Yankees owner, always had a different viewpoint of how he wanted to run the Yankees, he did not successfully pull that off right away. He reverted back to his dad's measures twice in the first 6 years. He took over in the 2008 offseason. They had the major spending spree right away, and that led to their last championship. And then they had another one in the 2013, 2014 offseason, one of those two that was another $400 million offseason spending spree. And it wasn't until 2016 when Brian Cashman, who had long been advocating to stop doing business this way, finally convinced Hale to sell off some of his best assets to get players like Gleyber Torres and Clint Frazier, et cetera. And so I'm really interested to see, because I do believe now, and I write this in the book, that more than ever, whether it was Brian Cashman and George Steinbrenner, or Gene Michael and George Steinbrenner, or anyone else that has been in the organization prior to this current iteration with Cashman and Hal Steinbrenner, that they work with each other for the first time. I think that Cashman and Hal Steinbrenner want it to work a little bit more closely in the beginning, but it's hard to break family practices, as if running business isn't a hard enough thing to do. And so I think Hal and Brian are more than ever aligned with their vision for what the Yankees are. And what the Yankees are right now is a cost control, fiscally financial organization. And for a lot of Yankee fans, that rubs them the wrong way. You can see it on Twitter all the time. Just hop on Twitter. A week ago, the world was coming to an end, not because of a pandemic, but because the Yankees had fallen to 500 in the 60-game weird season, and they didn't do anything at the trade deadline. And people are killing Cashman about his analytics and why is this player playing? Why is Miguel Andujar not getting more at bats. Well, it's because he can't play defense. I mean, come on, it's not that hard to figure these things out, but it drives Yankee fans crazy that they do not go out and spend like they do for Garrett Cole every single year, and that they do not go out and make trades like they did for Roger Clemens and for Chuck Knobloch and all these players that they got in the dynasty, because Brian Cashman just simply will not sacrifice his farm system and the organizational structure that they've built now over the past 3, 4, 5 years for one shot at a championship. His job is to make the Yankees contend year after year. And I think when you talk about excellence, so there's two sides to this. There's the side with the Yankees organization. I think their mandate, yes, is still to win a championship every season. And if you're in professional baseball, yes, the goal is to win a championship. But it's like I tell people when I'm working in college athletics or when I'm working in high school athletics, everyone has the same goal. So and simple math tells us that only one team can win a championship. So the odds of you being that team aren't very high. And if that is the only thing that is driving you, we saw what that did to the Yankees organization. They became the toxicity of baseball in the late 80s and early 90s because their sole quest was to win a championship. And George Steinbrenner did everything at the cost of winning a championship. He eroded all the talent that they had built up early in the 70s. He eroded all the leadership that they had. I mean, thankfully they had Don Mattingly all those years to kind of carry something over toward the end. But it was just destroyed. And whether Yankee fans want to like that or not, Brian Cashman and Hale Steinbrenner aren't going to go down that path. I mean, maybe if Hale is getting ready to sell the team in 3 or 4 years, he might take one last shot and say, screw it, we're blowing it all up, we're going to go for it. But if they're in this for the long run, and there's every indication that there is, this is the way that they are going to operate. And it's going to mean less championships because the Yankees can't afford to be at $300 million as a payroll, for example, and pay out all these other teams, because then those teams get better and the Yankees, they get older. they lose out on the ability to acquire other people. There's just so many different ramifications when you talk about the money aspect in the way that Major League Baseball is set up. Baseball is set up, when that vote happened for the CBA in 2000, there was one owner that voted against it. And that owner was George Steinbrenner, because he knew fundamentally that was going to change the way that baseball and the Yankees operated. It's made things more difficult. It doesn't mean they can't succeed. And it doesn't mean that people don't want to come play for the Yankees.
Right.
I mean, you have people like CC Sabathia coming back for 1-year deals. You have people like a DJ LeMahieu who didn't even know where he was going to play prior to last season, coming because this is the Yankees. I have a shot to compete. I have a shot to become part of that Yankee lore. And the Yankees have built this where not only can they, can they say what they did in the past and use that in a recruiting pitch, for example, but they have the future to look forward to. And that future still looks bright, even if they haven't won a championship in 10 seasons.
All right, Colin, we got to wrap it up.
Yeah.
We are up on my Zoom time limit here.
Okay.
The name of the book is Culture of Excellence, What We Can Learn from the Yankees About Leadership. It's by Colin Cerniglia. And Colin, where can people purchase the book?
Yeah, book's available September 15th, tomorrow, on all major platforms. It's hopefully going to start being in bookstores too when things when this pandemic open up. But if you go to my website, talent409.com/culture of excellence, you can find all the options, buy directly from me. I have some goodies that you can buy as well, bookmarks and stuff like that. But yeah, everything's right on the website.
Best of luck, buddy.
All right. Thanks so much, Mark. Appreciate it.
Take care.